So bula everybody. Thanks for stopping by. Bula Suva, bula Fiji. The bula Australia, bula New Zealand, the bula America, nakala siya mamay. Vinaka vakalevu nasema mai ni mbula vinaka na veiwakani onisema tiku mai na ka vinaka nikua mbula vinaka meuri talofa malolele vikimnikere sara to all of you who are connecting in from all over the world, particularly for our friends in Fiji and also our friends who are from Fiji, who are connecting in from different parts of the world, who are still celebrating on the win of the sevens team in Tokyo in Japan for the men's team. But I know the Fijiana team is also qualified for the quarterfinals. So we are very, very excited to hear about the women's rugby achievement. So to the Fijiana team, go Fiji, go. And I know you will do so well over there in Tokyo. So as most of you have seen the poster that I've shared today, we have a guest with us. And yesterday we traveled to the island of Tuvalu. And today we will be going to the island of Rabe. And so we've been traveling to different parts of Fiji this year. In January, we traveled to the province of Naronga, Nabosa, and then followed by the province of Mba. We went to the province of Ra, followed by Netasiri, Teilevu, VITI, and we just completed the province of Rewa. And this week we decided, hey, before we go to the province of Kandavu, I think it'll be really wonderful to also include the island of Kioa and the island of Rabe. And so to our listeners who are listening in tonight, we're so happy that you're able to join us to listen to our Talanoa. Today we are really, really honored and very pleased to have Associate Professor Katerina Teaiwa connecting in from the beautiful city of Canberra in Australia. Kam mauri, Dr. Katerina.
Kona Maori Tarisi, Nisambula Vinaka to you and to your listeners. It's so wonderful to be talking to you this evening. And we are very grateful for anyone who switched from rugby sevens to listen to us tonight. But we fully understand the intense importance of rugby sevens, both men and women, to those of us from Fiji. So excited for everyone, and especially given everything that's going on at home with COVID and all of the challenges. But Vinaka Vakalevu for inviting me to Talanoa with you. I'm very excited to talk a little bit about Rabe Island. And yes, I'm coming from Canberra, where I think it's maybe 0 degrees at the moment.
I was just gonna ask what the temperature is like there, because right now I have a big fan blowing from behind me, because we're on the opposite spectrum of the world. But Vinaka Vakalevu, despite the family arrangements at your beautiful home in Canberra and the weather, you still agreed to join me on this Talanoa session, particularly, remembering the islands of Rabe and Kioa and Rotuma. We also covered Rotuma in the month of May. And even when we were doing the schedule this year, a lot of people were like, oh, because we had Kandavu, because, I'm from Kandavu, and we had Kandavu, Rabe, and Kioa. So people were inquiring, is Rabe and Kioa part of Kandavu? I was like, I wish.
Ooh, very different.
And so, when I explained to them and I said, well, it's very nice for all of us, not to forget that, Fiji have other, ethnic groups and other island groups from the region who are part of Fiji. And so it'll be just wonderful to include your voices, your voices and your history, and just going down memory lane. Yeah, going down memory lane, and for you to share anything that you would like to share with us today. So to kickstart our Talanoa, would it be possible just for you to introduce yourself to us, your upbringing, the schools that you went to, and the work that you currently do?
Yes. Okay, Vinaka. Korapa and Kamrapa to all of those who are listening. So I was born in Sabu Sabu on Vanuatu. And my family kind of moved around a little bit. We lived in Lautoka, then we ended up in Suva, and eventually in Tadirua Heights, where my parents still live. But my father is from Rabe. And as some of your listeners, maybe not all, but some people may know, the people who live on Rabe at the moment are the Banabin people. And the Banabans are originally from Kiribati. And they were moved from Kiribati. At the time, it was the Gilbert and Ellice Islands. So the Gilbert and Ellice Islands are now Kiribati and Tuvalu. But they were moved from there in 1945 after the war. They were picked up from Japanese war camps, and they were brought on a big ship to Rabe in 1945. My great-grandfather, Tenamo, was one of those who came on that ship. And not long after my grandfather, Teaiwa. So that's our surname, is Teaiwa, which is my grandfather's first name. And his father was Tenamo. And Tenamo came on the ship with about 700 Banabans in 1945, and about 300 from the Gilbert Islands who were intermarried with the Banabans. So about 1,000 people arrived in 1945 on December 15th and landed on Rabe. And at the time, Rabe had already kind of been displaced from, Itauke, the original, those who are indigenous to Rabe. I believe it was Rambe, not Rabe. When Itauke lived there, And that was back in 1850. It had to do with a war that was going on at the time with the Tui Vakau. And when they had brought Tongan, I guess is the word mercenaries, or people warriors in from Tonga to fight on behalf or with Fijians. And the island of Rabe had been lost in that war, and the Itake of Rabe displaced to the region, you know, around Buda and Tabiuni and elsewhere. When that war, that war was lost, and it was given to Tongans, but then Tongans sold it to plantation owners. And so I think it exchanged hands a couple of times with different European plantation owners, eventually landing in the hands of the Lewe brothers, you know, the very famous copra and big, you know, European business in Fiji, the Lewe brothers, who used to make soap and other things. And it was in the ownership of the Lewe brothers when the British Phosphate Commission bought it off of them. So that's kind of just a little bit of a background of you know, Banabans and how they got there. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute.
Sure.
But in terms of who I am as a descendant of those who came in 1945, my father's John Tabakitoa Teaiwa. He used to be a civil servant in Fiji, permanent secretary of agriculture and fisheries and forestry for a long time in Fiji, and a few other ministries as well. He was the first Banaban to go to university, you know, a couple of decades after they first came to Fiji. And he comes from a family of 10. So he had 9 brothers and sisters. One passed away, but I have 50 first cousins. I have 50 first cousins, and they're on Rambi, and they're around Fiji, and they're in Australia and New Zealand and the US and elsewhere. And our villages on Rambi are Tabiang. We live just outside Tabiang at Tapona is where our kainga is. We're a family that tried to recreate the Banaban kainga on Rambi, because a lot of the families were a bit dispersed from each other. And we're also from the village of Tapuewa on Rambi. So from 2 villages on Rambi. And then my grandmother is Tabitewean from Kiribati. So that's my connection to Rambi, and a little bit about our genealogy and family history, and a little bit about what Rambi is and how the Banabans got there. But I'll talk more about that when I talk about my research. But shout out to my 50 first cousins and all their children. We are a big family, and we're a very close family, but I don't often get to see all my cousins, especially not from Canberra.
So, wow. And now also saying bula to those of you connecting in from Samu. I didn't know you were born there. So it's nice to see your connection to Samu.
Yes.
Wow. And also when you went to school, what were the schools that you went to?
So I went to Yatsen Primary School in Suva. We're from a Catholic family, but I remember when we moved from Lautoka to Suva, I think the school year had already started, and I think maybe my parents tried to get me into St. Anne's, me and my 2 sisters, my older sister Teresia, my younger sister Maria. Maria was born in Lautoka. Teresia was born in Hawaii when my father was doing his university studies. But we moved to Suva, and then I think we missed the deadline to get into St. Anne's. And then we went to Yatsen Primary School because my mom was working at USP, the Lavala campus. And so we were living in that area, and we ended up all going to Yatsen Primary School. And then after that, I went on to and my sisters did as well, to St. Joseph's Secondary School in Samambula. So that's my school background. And yes, whenever I come across people from grammar and ACS, then it is very meaningful when you're from St. Joseph's in the late 1980s and 1990s. Those were, you know, the schools that we competed against in the Suva athletics.
So big shout out to the old girls of St. Joseph's and also students who are still going to St. Joseph's. So here you have one of your old girls, you know, connecting in from Canberra. So Vinakavakalevu, Dr. Katerina, for sharing your journey, especially, you know, where you grew up and the schools that you went to. And when you went to university, what was the pathway that you followed?
Yes. So when my father, you know, I said he was the first Banaban to go to university. He ended up studying at the East-West Center, Honolulu, at the University of Hawaii, studying agriculture. And there he met my mom, who is American. My mom is from Washington, D.C. So that meant when we were born, after my parents got married and my elder sister Teresia was born in Honolulu, and they moved back to Fiji so that my father could start his work in the agriculture industry. My mom gave us American citizenship because she was American. So we were born in Fiji, and we also had American citizenship as well. She came from a military family. An American military family. My grandfather, John Martin. There's a lot of Johns in our family, by the way. So my father's name is John and my grandfather's name was John, but he was a colonel in the US Army. And he, you know, lived and worked all around the world, and my mom and her siblings would live in Germany and Japan and other places where the United States was, you know, had military camps, especially after World War II. And eventually she went on to do a master's at the University of Hawaii, and that's where she met my father, and they fell in love and they got married, and she decided to move to Fiji, and she was a school teacher in Fiji. That was her background, and her training was as a teacher. And I think their first place, one of the first places they lived was Nausori. Yeah. And so that was my pathway to doing my, you know, my university studies in the United States, because as a US, you know, as somebody who was half American, we had access to certain scholarships and things like that, that many from the Pacific, you know, may not have, you know, the same pathways towards. And also because we were Catholic. So my sisters and I all went to Catholic universities. My elder sister went to Trinity College in Washington, D.C., which was the same college that my mother went to. I don't think there were any other Pacific Islanders who went to Trinity College. It was an all-women's college. But then my younger sister and I, we decided California was a bit more closer to the Pacific because Washington, D.C. was really far away. And both my younger sister and I were so attached to Fiji. Like it was very difficult for us to leave home. We had to go back to Fiji all the time, especially me. Even though, you know, we were technically American, it was very difficult for me to connect with American culture. So I just needed to be able to go back home to Fiji whenever I could. So Santa Clara University, where we went to do our undergraduate studies, is in California. It's near San Jose. It's part of Santa Clara County, and it's a very small Catholic Jesuit university. So that was something that was very familiar to us, you know, as people who'd come up through the Catholic school system in Fiji. And believe it or not, there was a Rotuman going to school there at the time. And so I had like an adopted brother instantaneously. And there was also someone who was from the West, from Lautoka, from another family that we knew really well. And they were both at the same university. So we were like, oh, good, there's islanders here.
Wow. So no wonder you all just bonded straight away, yeah?
Yeah, that's right.
Yes. Oh, that's wonderful. And again, when you're there in the States, and it's those little things, say, that you, often take for granted, even by looking out into the ocean across the Pacific, Fiji's on the other side. And because when you're in Washington, D.C., it's on the other side. So you
That's
only
right.
just see the Atlantic Ocean, if you go over to the coast. So wow, Vinakawa Levo for sharing your journey. And maybe when we touch on the topic of research, because I know that you also into dancing, right? I remember you performing quite a lot in some of your work. So I love to hear about that too. But before we go into your research part, I was wanting to see whether you could, just share a little bit about, Banaba and your family link, which you've already started, just to add a little bit more, into the history or language or culture, any aspect of it that you want to share with our listeners today.
Okay, sure. So the Banaban people are from an island in the western part of what is now Kiribati. It is quite far from the other islands in Kiribati. So I think many people, when they think of Kiribati, they think of very low-lying coral atolls, many of which are really facing challenging situation under climate change. But the Banabans come from the high island, the only high island in Kiribati, which is a raised coral atoll. And it's, well, by boat, it took me about 3 days, on a small boat to get to Banaba. And historically, Banaba is not part of the Gilbert group. So the Gilbert Islands are, they're more like an archipelago, they're kind of all in a line near the equator there in the Central Pacific. And Banaba is further away to the west, and its closest neighbor is actually Nauru. So Banabans and Nauruans are more closely related in a geographic and cultural and geological kind of sense. They're the closest neighbors to each other. And then you have the Gilbertese chain to the east, and then you have the other like Phoenix and Line Islands and Christmas Island, etc. And so the Banabans were only really brought into the Kiribati, group because of the phosphate that was there on the
Got
island.
a map there just to help with the orientation.
Excellent. That's the map that we need. So you can see Banaba there in the west, and you can sort of see the rest of the islands to the east going this way. But Nauru is the closest island to Banaba, but it's still quite far away, like, I don't know, like 200 kilometers away. So from Banaba, you can't see any other island. You can't see any other island. 360 degrees, there's no other island in view. So it is quite on its own out there in the Pacific Ocean, which means a very unique kind of culture developed. Now, for many different reasons. First, it's a very small island.
Yeah.
It's 6 square kilometers. Wow. That's it. That's the whole entire island. So it's 2.5 square miles, which is about just over 6 square kilometers. And the ancestors of the Banabans probably came from Vanuatu and from, a few other parts of the Pacific. But then there were waves of migration from those Gilbert Islands. And then the Gilbert Islands also have connections to Samoa as well. But the original inhabitants of Banaba were probably more closely associated with what people imagine as Melanesians. So then there were these waves of migration from different parts of the Gilbert Islands, and our oral traditions talk about, the island of Peru, for example. And there was intermarriages, and with these subsequent migrations, there was a little bit of transformation of culture, a little bit of transformation of language, but Banaba was still a unique culture in and of itself because of its geography. Meaning the kind of culture that emerges on a low-lying coral atoll is a very specific kind of, pragmatic culture that's based on the kinds of resources that are available, the kind of flora and fauna that's available on low-lying coral atolls. Whereas Banaba, because it's a raised high coral atoll, there's no lagoon, in the Gilbert Islands, you have a lagoon side and you have an ocean side, and you collect different kinds of food from those different environmental zones. Banaba was really specific. We don't really, we kind of have a reef, but the reef is so close. You might as well, you just walk from the land and there's the reef. There's the reef Saranga. You're just like, that's the end of the island. And then it's deep ocean. So it's like this tiny little island, and you take 2 steps this way and boom, you're in the deep ocean right away. So what that means is the kind of fishing techniques, the kind of food gathering techniques, all of that was unique and it was different. It was different from the other islands. The other important thing about Banaba is the source of fresh water. So on Banaba, where are you going to get your fresh water, right? And this is the issue for all of those islands kind of in the central Pacific along the equator. In Banaba, rain would fall and it would collect in deep underwater caves. And so Banabans developed a system of gathering water that was very particular to the women, who would have to crawl into the caves and collect the water and bring it out and then distribute it to families. And that's a very different way from gathering water compared with what they do in the Gilbert Islands. So quite a unique gendered culture emerges on Banaba around these different techniques of gathering water. Whose role is it? How do you distribute it? Where are the entry points to the water, freshwater sources? A whole very pragmatic sort of economic, social, and political system develops on Banaba that makes a lot of sense when you have a small population living on a small island with limited resources, surrounded by deep, deep, deep ocean. And your closest neighbor, it will take you a very long time in a canoe to get there. So that was Banaba, and it was so, I don't like using the word remote, because when people use the word remote, it makes it sound like you're on the moon or something. But Banaba was kind of remote in that sense that when the British and the French and the Germans and all the people were carving up the Pacific, they left Banaba out. Banaba was not included because everyone was like, what's that? They couldn't see what the potential or why they should be interested in that island, so it was kind of like, nobody was rushing to Banaba to put a line, like how this lovely map here now makes sure the red line goes to the west of Banaba to include it, until they found phosphate. Until they found phosphate in 1900. After that was the rest of history. So Banabans had kind of, developed this very unique, very resilient culture in quite a difficult environment where there were a lot of droughts where, the water might run out and people might starve, and they went through a lot of hardships, but they always came back to their island, and they always stayed with their island, because for Banabans, the concept of belonging to the land, Tsiapa, is similar in other parts of the Pacific. The land and the people are one and the same. So you are one and the same with the rocks. And it's a very rocky landscape that's made out of phosphate. And phosphate is a combination of bird droppings from, birds that used to nest on the island for thousands and thousands of years, but also the dead maritime, the ocean a life that used to accumulate on, you know, the bedrock of Banaba and kind of build up over time, you know, all the different kinds of marine life that would become part of the sedimented rock, and it fused together with the bird droppings, and it becomes this very, very rich source of phosphate, which is a bit different from guano. Guano is more pure bird and bat and, you know, other kinds of droppings which are not as old as phosphate. Phosphate is sedimented rock that fuses together over long, long periods of time, so that it's quite ancient. It's quite an ancient source of phosphate. And Banaba is purely phosphate. And in our oral tradition, we are the people of the rock that land from the sky. So the concept is that Banaba falls from the sky, but it's already rock. So this concept of belonging to the rock is really deeply ingrained in a kind of a Banaban sense of identity. And they would have had their own unique language, but through time and through intermarriage with others, you know, new words get introduced, and the language starts heading more to the Gilbertese, to the Kiribati language. And then when the missionaries arrive, they produce the Bible in the Kiribati language, which then becomes part of that kind of Kiribati language, kind of becoming the lingua franca of the whole of the Gilbert and Ellice Islands colony. So now Banabans kind of struggle to find their old words, which they know are Banaban words, which are not Gilbertese words. And one word that we learned growing up was kaka, which is the word for grandparents. Ten kaka and ne kaka, which is unique to Banaba. It's not in the rest of Kiribati. So that's kind of that history of what Banaba was before before phosphate was discovered. Then it was discovered by the New Zealanders and the Australians, and full speed, no stop. Full speed mining takes over the whole island, because that phosphate was very, very lucrative. That phosphate fueled the agriculture, the growth and the development of agriculture in Australia and New Zealand, and the British government supported the extraction of that resource because they knew it was very valuable. And same company was mining on Nauru, and there were a few other islands across the Pacific, but they discovered the phosphate and they mined that whole thing as much as they could. And that led to the displacement of Banabans.
Right, so that's from that. What happened then from 1900s connects to Fiji with the purchase of the island of Rabe, yeah?
That's correct.
Wow. And I also remembered, was it last year or before COVID, you had a touring exhibition that you had in New Zealand. Would you like to share a little bit about that exhibition?
Yes. So when after I did my undergraduate, I went on to do a master's in Pacific Island Studies at the University of Hawaii. And then I went on to do a PhD at the Australian National University. And my PhD was in anthropology, but I was really more of an interdisciplinary scholar, where I was like history, culture, music, dance, all of those things were really important to me. And because I had a background in dance, I used to be part of the Oceania Dance Theatre at the University of the South Pacific with Epeli Ha'ofa and Alan Alo in the early days. I always paid attention to the arts. And I always valued the arts. So when I was doing my research about Banaba at the PhD level, and I was very inspired by my elder sister, Teresia, to go into that area because she had decided to do different research. So when that kind of like opened up the door for, if somebody in the family is going to do the Banaban research, then it's going to be me. And so I used a video camera. You know, this is like the year 2000. This is the millennium. And you can imagine what the video cameras look like in the year 2000. But I went all over Fiji and Kiribati and other places with my video camera, and I filmed communities. I filmed their everyday life. I filmed their dancing. I was teaching dances. You know, I was teaching my Oceania Center dancers, and they were teaching me Kiribati dances, but I was interviewing people who remembered working on the island and remembered this history of phosphate mining, because Tuvaluans and Gilbertese both worked on Banaba in the mines. They were hired by the Australians and the New Zealanders. So there were more, you know, through the mining, there would be more Tuvaluans and Gilbertese on the island than the Banabans themselves, because they were brought in as the laborers to do the mining. And there was a lot of interesting exchanges amongst those cultures as well. There's all these interesting dances, for example, and chants that have come out of that period, because all of these, you know, usually men are kind of working in a really intense way in the mining fields, and they're trying to keep themselves happy, and they're in the mine, and they're on the boat, they're on the ship, you know, they're wearing their sulus and lava-lavas with no hard hats and no shoes half the time. You know, there's like no work health and safety going on in those mines. And I found all of these archives about that history in Australia and New Zealand. So I took my video camera so I could track, you know, some of these men who were then quite elderly in 2000, but they had worked on the mines. Because I had used a video camera, and I used photographs, and I used not just writing, not just writing and text, but I used all of these different forms. I was then able to generate artworks out of that. So I made little films, you know, like not the kind of films you would put on Fiji One, or, you know, like more like, you know, me trying to make sense of history in visual ways. You know, I would sit in an editing studio with my mentor, Gary Kildare, who was a filmmaker as well. And we just look at all of this footage from Rabe, from Tarawa, some from Suva, you know, from Tabitawea. I went to Tabitawea, and I found my family on Tabitawea, my grandmother's family. And I also found some unimane, some elder men who had worked on Banaba, and they were so excited that somebody wanted to ask them questions about, you know, what life was like on the island. So long story short, the result of that became an exhibition that I have been doing now for a few years, and being very inspired by other Pacific artists as a way of getting our story out to broader audiences. So I work very closely with Yuki Kihara, who is a very well-known Samoan, Japanese, and Aotearoa New Zealand artist. And she has mentored me a lot to take this story and translate it into the visual arts, so that we can share more broadly how histories of environmental extraction and things like phosphate mining continue to impact our Pacific people in the present. So even though this is a historical story, you know, they mined the island from 1900 to 1980. 1980 is the last shipment of phosphate from Banaba to Australia and New Zealand and to other places. Banabans continue to experience, you know, the impacts of that mining, and also the displacement, and, you know, they have lots of challenges in Fiji. So, you know, I think at one time, especially in the 50s and the 60s, and maybe even part of the 70s, when they had some royalties from the mining, they were in a good economic place, but that was very short-lived, and the royalties were very minor compared to the wealth generated by the phosphate fertilizer in the global industry. So Banabans, have become actually, quite a economically challenged community in Fiji, and have also gone through periods of extreme political turmoil as well, because of the kinds of legislation and regulatory systems that were set up or not set up well for them in Fiji. So they're very much a minority community in Fiji that faces a whole range of challenges, while at the same time trying to revitalize and keep alive their culture in Fiji. And they do it in all kinds of different ways in the northern part of Fiji, in dialogue with the Tuvaluans from Kioa, and in dialogue and intermarriage with Kioans and with Itauke from all across the bay. Banabans are intermarried with Rotumans and Indo-Fijian families, and a new unique culture of Rambi people has emerged in Fiji, where you're still connected to Banaba, which is your ancestral land. That's where our ancestors come from, and we never forget them. But culturally, through music and dance and language, most Banabans, especially from Rambi, they speak Fijian, they speak Kiribati language, some of them can speak Tuvaluan. They've kind of have this fusion, kind of a fusion culture, and you can see it in their dancing as well. So I'm sure people in Fiji or people from Fiji are very familiar with Rambi dancing and Banaban dancing, which is usually very exciting. And sometimes they have a drum kit, and they bring their drum and they put it in the middle of the rugby field, and they do their performance. But they also have a choir that's singing together with the drums, and then you have the dancers. This is part of the Banaban cultural revitalization in Fiji, and with the 4 villages on Rambi, which are Tabuewa, Uma, Tabyang, and Buakonikai, which are kind of like transplanted from Banaba to Rambi in Fiji, but on a much bigger landscape, because Rambi is way bigger. I think it must be over 4 times bigger than Banaba, and a whole different landscape for Banabans to, kind of navigate and also connect to, knowing that they are not indigenous to that island, but it is their home. So they have to navigate Itauke histories and ancestral, connections on Rambi, while at the same time trying to make sense of who they are as a community in Fiji, and how they relate to the other cultures around them. So one of the things that I've noticed about Banabans is we are very resilient and very kind of like strategic, in that you have to be aware and conscious of lots of other different people, and aware also of your precarious position as an indigenous diaspora in a country like Fiji.
Man, that's amazing. And are there still people on Banaba, on the island of Banaba?
Yes. So one of the things that happened after the Banabans were displaced in 1945, there was always a Banaban presence back on the home island, but in the 1970s, they sent what they would call their rorobuaka, their young, strong people back to Banaba, kind of as like guardians and like an occupying force on the island, because they were getting very upset about the mining. I know my grandparents were part of that group that accompanied those who went back. And I know that because one of their sons, they left on Banaba and he stayed on Banaba every time. my uncle, who is now in Kiribati. So young, strong people were sent back kind of like to protest against the mining. And there were skirmishes with the police and all kinds of dramas. And so the result of that is there's about 300 people who live on Banaba, kind of like caretakers. They're like the caretakers of the island, but the island is so mined out that you can't really see, you know, where your land boundaries are, where your old villages were. You can't read the landscape in the same way because the soil has been removed. So I'm one of the few Banabans who's been lucky enough to go to and visit Banaba twice. Most Banabans have never been to Banaba because it's very difficult to get to Banaba. This is why currently they're facing a lot of challenges around resources, including fresh water. But my father became the chairman of the Rambi Council of Leaders, which is supposed to be the governing council for Rambi and for all islands. And they also usually have a member of parliament that sits in the Kiribati parliament. So he was chairman, and because he had to visit Banaba, I was able to go along and be very privileged to actually visit our ancestral island. And then the second time I went back was for my research. So I have been there, I have walked across the island, I have gone into the Panga, which are the freshwater caves. I've spent some harrowing nights on Banaba because it can be quite beautiful, it can be quite powerful, but it can also be quite sad. And it's really layered with different layers of history. So from the mining, so indigenous ancestral Banaban layers, then the phosphate mining layers and all the colonial layers, and then the Japanese layers as well, because Japan targeted Banaba for occupation because of the mining. So Japan was a buyer of phosphate, and they said, oh, this looks like a good island to occupy during World War II. So you have all of those layers of kind of like death and destruction in a very small environment on Banaba, and you can feel that history on Banaba. It's a bit like walking through a cemetery in a way where you have to be very respectful, you have to be very careful. When I was making my journey the second time to Banaba, everyone in Tarawa, in Kiribati said, where are you going? I said, oh, we're going to Banaba. They said, oh my goodness, can't believe people are going to Banaba. And then they were like, oh, wait, are you Banaban? And I said, yes, I'm Banaban. They said, oh, thank goodness. You're okay, you're okay. Because they think of Banaba as this very historically, culturally, and spiritually very charged place, you know, where you have all of these layers of big things, industry, history, World War II, all happening in one place. So I take this idea as a Banaban woman of kind of being of Banaban descent and having to be a caretaker of the land quite seriously, even though our land is dispersed. My research continues to track that land and think about where that land went, which is like Australia and New Zealand. So it makes sense for me to be in Australia because our ancestral land is here. You know, it makes sense when my sister went to New Zealand because our ancestral land is there. It's everywhere. Women were guardians, you know, they were guardians of the land, and you continue to take that seriously, even into the future, even through displacement, even through mining, and you continue to tell your children and your grandchildren that story so they can remember and they can continue to care for that island. So that's what's been fueling my research now for 20 years. Just this idea that we continue to care for and take care of that island, regardless of where it is. And you know, sometimes that can be hard to think about, because Banabin people and Rambi Islanders are facing so many current social and political and economic issues at the moment, particularly under COVID. You know, there are young Banabins on VITI level right now who are distributing food to Banabin families, because those Banabin families are suffering, and they don't have electricity in VITI level, and they also don't have electricity on Rambi. There's no source of electricity. It's all generators on Rambi. And so in terms of our priorities as Banabans, we've got to balance care for the homeland with care for the people in the present, right? And sometimes that pulls us in different directions. But luckily we have some wonderful young Banaban leaders, well, some elders and some young Banaban leaders who are doing that work. And so I just want to give a shout out to my auntie Pelenise Alofa in Kiribati, who continues all her amazing work in the climate action movement and in Ikiribati and Banabin health and well-being there, and Isinterunga Rabe, who is an amazing Banabin leader and scholar and social worker, who's currently walking all around Rambi right now doing this mapping and scoping exercise and working with the Fijian government and working with the remnants of a Rambi Council. We don't have a working Rambi Council of Leaders at the moment, unfortunately, but there's lots of young, you know, Banabin people who are trying their very best to support other Banabans, and they're also elders. So we have Unimane and Unaine, who are elder men and women who are continuing to support their communities. We have amazing people like Terikano Takesau, who runs coconut oil, pure virgin coconut oil for the women on Rambi, and thinking about like organic coconut oil and doing amazing work all across Rambi, and she was in Kiribati recently during lockdown. I'm in real awe of these Banabans who have developed amazing skills and ways of being in the world in spite of coming from a situation of displacement and trauma and just so many things that have happened to our people and to our land as well.
So, man, what a wonderful way of you acknowledging, you know, your auntie and those women and those young people who, you know, fighting for, you know, recognition, even fighting for, you know, the existence of power. You know, I did know that the island of Rambi just have the generators as for the power for them to use on the island. Pinaka for, you know, sharing these real stories, and we have so many people watching and listening in, and they're sharing their appreciation of you sharing about this, because I can speak for myself. You know, while growing up in Fiji, I hardly see any of these stories or history even included in our you know, school curriculum. There may be few of information here and there, but I think what you're doing now, through the amazing work that you do through exhibitions and using the art and your book as well, is, you know, shedding some light, you know, into the struggles of your people on Rambi, and how you also, you know, highlighting the issue of, you know, cultural identity. Particularly for youth, young ones coming up, they kind of thinking, am I Fijian? Am I, you know, from Kiribati? Or my grandmother is Rutuman, and now my brother-in-law is Tuvaluan. You know, it's a lot of these changes that are happening. But I think on the bright side of it, as you're saying, you know, there's a new kind of way of language coming up, a new way of dance that are being created. So what would you advise, you know, any young, you know, Rambi young, woman or young man who is listening today, just kind of, like encouraging them in terms of their own cultural identity in this new millennium, Dr. Katerina?
I would definitely advise all our young people, I mean, and even those of us my age as well, to know our history and to continue to care for Banaba. Sometimes we have real intergenerational differences and divides where when younger people don't remember, and they've never been to the island, or it's not something that's very present in their lives, sometimes people think, well, why should I prioritize that? So, the basis of all our identities as Pacific people is the land. It is the land and the ocean. No matter what happens, no matter, we are all of mixed heritage, really. We all are, married to different communities and cultures and all of that, but it doesn't mean we forget our ancestors, and it doesn't mean we forget the land. So for me, it was so inspiring, meaningful, and grounding to go back to Banaba. And I also went to Tabitawea as well to get that sense, that really powerful sense of grounding, as in you're standing in a place where your ancestors have been and born and lived and died for thousands of years. And that doesn't mean, that things in the present aren't important. What it means is you're standing in a very strong place to think about the present and the future with your values very clear and very intact. And that's even for someone like me who wasn't raised speaking the language, because like many of us our age, our parents thought, oh, it'd be better for you to do everything in English, because then you can go on to uni and so on and so forth. So even though I wasn't fluent in the language and the culture, that didn't change that sense of who I come from, right? Those people who have come before. That has always been very, very powerful in my life, even when I was a young child, that very strong sense of the ancestors. That presence has always been there. So it's always been about maintaining that thread. And that's what I encourage young people to do, because we will have many influences from the whole globe. And they're wonderful, they're creative. You go to TikTok and you see all the indigenous peoples on TikTok, and they're remembering their ancestors on TikTok too. So even all of these new platforms and influences, they don't take us away from who we are and where we come from. That is what's so powerful about being a Pacific person, belonging to our islands, belonging to that ocean. We will never give that up. We will never give that up. So that's what I encourage our young people to do. Do Pacific studies. You can do it along with economics and law and everything else. But I got it from Pacific studies. I got it from Pacific studies. I didn't get it in my high school, primary school curriculum. I got that sense of the Pacific and who I was and where I come from by focusing on the Pacific. And so I want to give a shout out to my father and my mother and to my aunties and my uncles and all my cousins, the children of Tirianako, Teruamwi, Takaya, Tebarutu, Rakoma, Eritai, Tekarika, and Taita. We are the Teaiwa family. We are the descendants of Teaiwa and Takewa. And I know my genealogy going back now about 10 generations.
Man, that is so beautiful. I just love the fact that you just acknowledge them and just to hear their names. Just so beautiful. I love it. You can just see and feel the reconnection, and it's just so beautiful that way that you, with it, for us, we can hear it. And for you, you have that deep connection, yeah, to all of them, and they're just so wonderful. So vinaka lewu, for highlighting that. And yes, to Pacific Studies. So for those of you who are listening in, wherever you're listening in from the US, from Australia, from New Zealand, and even in Fiji at USP, as what Dr. Katerina is saying, you can take economics, you can take land management, you can take law, but Pacific Studies is always there. And I'm sure Pacific Studies is going to ground you, right? And I'll say it again, ground you. And look what happened to Dr. Katerina, and for myself too, I just loved it. And it doesn't mean, this is something I hear quite often, Dr. Katerina, when I was in New Zealand, a lot of the students that I met were saying, oh, I'm Samoan, or I'm Tongan, or I'm Fijian. I don't need to take that. That's actually wrong, in a way, it may be kind of, I think, maybe misunderstood. Maybe that's a better way, I should say. It's a really good way to reflect on ourselves. I see a lot of students, coming in and they're like, oh, really? Do I have to learn about Tonga? But I'm from Tonga. And I said, you will enjoy it. And definitely, yes. Yeah, so it's an eye-opener for them. And so thank you so much, Dr. Katerina, for mentioning about Pacific Studies. Check it out, check out University of Auckland, in many universities in New Zealand, even here in Hawaii, in Australia. Check out the Australian National University, where Dr. Katerina is based. So that is a wonderful course of study where it can allow you to view yourself, through history, through language, through dance, and the list goes on. That is so cool. And I also like the fact that you mentioned about, the land and how we are connected to the ocean and to the rocks, and things like culture and nature are one. That is just so beautiful. Can you just elaborate on that a little bit more? Particularly in Fiji with what's going on back home. And I know land is something that is tangible, but also has a lot of intangible properties.
Yes.
Dr. Katerina, just add some magic to that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think for me, it was really getting that sense of belonging to a place, and starting with Rabe when we visited when we were younger, but really going to Banaba and to Tabitawea and to feeling that presence in the landscape, but you have to be attuned to it as well. So for someone like me and all of us, who are Christian, for example, it isn't always something we are taught or something that's acknowledged in a very direct spiritual way because we are Christian. But for a Catholic, there are actually dimensions of being Catholic that acknowledge the environment, that acknowledge those who have come before. And that really helped me kind of reimagine that pantheon of ancestors who come from the land, right? Who are part of the land in very, very direct ways. I just want to acknowledge that Teveariki Tiaro, the wonderful Tevi, has just passed away. And this is something I used to discuss with him as well. So Tevi was a Kiribati scholar and artist, and we used to talk about the importance of acknowledging the spirits of the land. And for someone like me, it wasn't something that was actually taught to me in a very direct way, but my father was raised actually by someone who had never been baptized. And so he raised him according to the Kiribati ancestral spirituality. So my father used to tell us about that from when we were really small. So we were always very conscious of different kinds of spiritual forces in our lives, because that was something that was formative to his upbringing. And then when I went to Kiribati, I was like, oh yes, for sure, definitely, 100%. It's very active in the landscape. Kiribati very much acknowledge the spirits of the land and their Christian kind of heritage as well. Both are happening simultaneously. So this is where what makes the care for the land quite tangible, because it doesn't, land is not property, land is not something that can be bought or sold, it is not something that's there just for commercial purposes, it is not something there to be exploited, because it's old, it's ancient, and it's sentient. So if your ancestors and your relatives are of the land, it makes it very hard to do damage to that land. And Banaba is a very good example of why you should not do damage to the land. So it's like a living example of why, in a tangible but also intangible sense, right? So tangible in terms of the rocks, the landscape, the environment, the resources, the flora, the fauna, but then the intangible aspects, which are the language, the culture, the dances, the music, the chants, the oral traditions that emerge from it, both of those disrupted by phosphate mining, which means you know the potential of loss. You know the potential of losing all of that. So for those of us who know what that looks like, we are in a different place from, say, Samoans and Tongans and maybe, you know, many Itake who feel like, oh, our language is fine and our culture is fine. And it's like, well, actually, we know what happens when globalization and colonialism and neoliberal economics and environmental extraction actually target land and they target culture, and you potentially lose it, which is what motivates me. I know what happens when you can lose it. I know what happens, and I know what it looks like 100 years in advance of when that loss and destruction happens. And so Banaba is like a little warning to everyone, you know, in a way that, you know, the islands in the Marshalls that have been, where they had nuclear testing, those are other little warnings for other people not to go down that path. I think a lot of people thinking about deep sea mining, for example, at the moment, really need to give a hard think about what it means to actually, you damage one corner, you damage all the corners. You know, you try to commercialize something that's been around for millions and millions of years. You're not thinking in deep time. You're not thinking in deep future and deep past, right? So we really need to reorient how we think, how we do, how we value. We really need to think critically about that. And in a way, COVID pandemic has given everybody the chance to rethink, because it's so devastating and it's so all-encompassing. It affects food, it affects employment, it affects everyday life, it affects education. So maybe we could ask some questions about our choices, about our leadership. You know, we need to ask some choices about, you know, many of these things also relate to gender issues. Who's in charge? Do we give women a voice? Women probably have a whole range of different values that they are, you know, that they prioritize, or people of diverse gender, you know, diverse sexuality. These communities, they see things differently, they ask different questions, you know. We live in a patriarchal system in Oceania, and some of these choices that have been made by past and present leaders need to be reflected upon, I think. And mining and environmental extraction is all part of that. Who signed that document? Who opened the door? Who let that ship, you know, dock right there?
Wow, yes, man, that's so wonderful. And when you were talking as well, I recall Professor Wilson Hernico's film, The Land Has Eyes, you know.
The land has eyes.
Yeah, And so
right.
thank you so much for sharing your Banaban Talanoa, you know, because you're reminding us some real examples of what happened, and also with Nauru, also with, in the Marshall Islands with Bikini and Mururoa in, French Polynesia. So we have so many examples of what we should not do, or something we can learn from around the region. So Vinakawa Lewu for reminding us about that. And someone was asking us about your exhibition, the one you had in New Zealand. Have you had a chance to also, or plan to have it shown in Fiji too?
Yes, in fact, we tried to set up something with the Oceania Center a couple of years ago. Okay. And I think it was right before, poor USP has been on quite a journey in the last couple of years, in terms of governance and things like that. And we had a plan, we had a proposal, we had everything ready to go to have this exhibition done at USP. And then unfortunately, things happened and people moved around and people were no longer in particular jobs and positions, but it was front and center and very high on the agenda because of, Banabin students and other students and the kinds of educational kinds of activities that we could have done with Project Banaba in a space like the Oceania Center or the Mbure on the USP campus, but unfortunately that fell through. But I haven't given up. I hope one day when there is a space and maybe some support and infrastructure in Fiji to have an exhibition like this there's some parts of the exhibition which are small, but some of it is actually quite big. Okay. And so it's not the kind of exhibition necessarily that can go in a corner or outside. I'm just showing you some images from it, including images of my sister, Teaiwa, who is in the exhibition as well. And I have photographs, I have film, but I also have textiles. I have textiles in the exhibition that kind of tell the story about Banaba. And the textiles have the pinnacles that are the remains of the land, like the bones of the land are in the textiles. So we usually hang that from the sky as a way of thinking about land from the sky and land from the ocean. We have both in the exhibition, land from the sea and land from the sky. So I think my brain went like really big when I was thinking of this exhibition. And we put together textiles and a film and photographs and all kinds of things. So sometimes it's been challenging for me to think, where can I take this? But wherever I take it, it's meaningful to our history. Wherever I take it, it's been to Sydney, it's been to Hawke's Bay on the east coast of New Zealand, where there's a phosphate plant right there, right near the gallery where my exhibition was. And now it's going to Auckland, which was the center of the British Phosphate Commissioner's industry in New Zealand. They had an office right there in Auckland, so I can tell a story about Auckland. And then there are connections to Honolulu because our phosphate went to Honolulu. There are connections to Hong Kong because some of the early laborers who worked in the mines were from Hong Kong. There are all of these different places around the world where I can look at the archives and I can say, 3,000 tons went there and 3,000 tons went there and 2,000 men were recruited from here. And 100 people were recruited from there. So my research and Project Banaba is like a big map. It's like a big map which all connects back to Banaba in the middle of the Pacific. Right in so small, such a small island, such a big story.
Wow, man. And I'm just so happy that, you've taken this on board. And I recall the time when I was still at the Fiji Museum, and your beautiful sister, late Sister Teresia, was giving a talk down at CRC. And I remember, I think I took a taxi from the back of USB that way, and I stayed the whole night, and she was doing her poetry reading. And I still remember that evening, you know, like it was just yesterday. And that was the time when I started to, something just awoke in my brain. And for me to kind of like, I have to be aware of other histories, other stories, not just my own Itoke stories or any story from Kandavu where I'm from. I need to be aware of other stories around me. So I just want to acknowledge, you know, you and your sister, Dr. Teresia, for you know, using spoken word, you know, using the arts, you know, to tell your story. And I think you were both so creative that way, because you gained our attention. Because I was thinking, you know, if it was maybe through another form of maybe written work or any other usual way of writing something, it may just, you know, be forgotten. But you still write your books, but you had other avenues, you know. So was it always something that you and Teresia often talk about? Is it like a sisterly chat, if I may ask? Is that okay?
We did, but I think it's also part of our upbringing in our family, in that, you know, when you go to school and it's like maths and English and social studies are important, but art is not important. That wasn't the case in our family. That wasn't the case. With my mom and my dad, it was like maths, English, social studies, science, and music, and dance, and all the other kinds of arts, all equal. And we weren't a very wealthy family at all. But in fact, I think we drove the smallest car in the whole of Suva, which I used to be so embarrassed about. It was a Honda Civic, and it was like the tiny little blue car. And you know, when you're from Suva and everybody really likes to show off their big cars. So my parents would drive their tiny little Honda Civic. And from there, they graduated to a Toyota Corolla. And so we were like, oh, shame, you know. But they put their energy and their time and their effort into the arts and to academics. That was it. They were very, very clear about what their children would value. So I have no business skills, no accounting skills, and no legal skills. However, the arts and the sciences took us a very, very long, long way. And my parents are very humble. They're some of the most humble people you will ever meet. And it was about the values, just the values they instill. So for my sister, she just became a poet. My little sister, she was a dancer. She danced all the way through university. And then she became a medical doctor. She's an obstetrician and a gynecologist in New York City. And she's a very popular doctor there. Like all the women like to go and visit her. And then I did the same with dancing. I was studying and dancing, studying and dancing, studying and dancing. It was like reading and writing. Studying, dancing, reading, writing, no judgment and no devaluing of the arts, all equal, all a form of literacy. They're all forms of literacy. Amen. And coming from Pacific people who didn't have writing, we don't come from cultures where things were scribed in that way. It's just keeping those values the same as the ancestral values, right? So you're keeping it going all the way through the present. And I can tell you those skills are very needed today in the current world we live in. You definitely don't want a population of people who are non-poetic, who cannot sing and dance. You know, that's what keeps us human. So you may be very successful, but if you don't have that other part of your humanity, that affects quality of life for everyone, including our community. So, you know, I made a joke on Twitter about the rugby sevens team, because they sang so beautifully, you know, after their win. And I said, the day our rugby sevens team cannot sing in perfect harmony is the day of the apocalypse, right? We have to be very concerned when people can no longer sing in harmony in that way, because that's what makes you from Fiji. So if there are any forces, any influences that come in and stop people from being able to spontaneously sing and sing together and harmonize, you know something's going wrong. You know something's going wrong. And I know there's some of those forces out there where people are screaming and shouting instead of singing, you know? It's like, why are you screaming and shouting? Like, can we just like go back to singing well? You know, this is not just for entertainment. It's something that moves people's hearts and their souls and their spirits. That's how you win rugby sevens games. You know,
that's how we get gold medals.
That's it. So everyone in Fiji keeps singing in a socially distanced fashion. And vaccination.
So dear na sarangan, dear na to Dr. Katerina, singing, you're showing your, it's part of our life, our it's part of our DNA, and it's something that we just value. And when they just stood there and they start singing, you know, it just have goosebumps, and it's just so moving and so beautiful at the same time. So vinaka vakalevu, Dr. Katerina, for acknowledging the arts. I love that, because this is something that I see and a few other people too often talk about when it comes to the arts. So when you go to school, like you said, you know, your parents put it like in a very balanced, even linear fashion. It's all the same. No one is up or down or like crooked. But from my perspective, sometimes I see, you know, like when it comes to the arts, it's sort of like math, English, social studies, basic science. Oh, arts, you guys go over there. There's a coconut shell there for you to go at. So from a high school perspective, it's like, oh, so everything else in the laboratory, in the proper classroom, art and craft, you go on the other side. So you already see how things are classed. So, wow. So to your mom and dad, vinaka vakalevu, for, you know, reminding us, and for those of us listening in tonight and those who will watch our interview later on, is for us to see arts just like, you know, any other subjects that you learn in school, like science or mathematics or accounting or economics. Woo, man, I'm so happy. And I know Chisoni Nangai is listening in Bulavinaka Kai. I'm sure after this Talanoa, you'll have a big enrollment for Pacific Studies. So you better watch out. So that's something that we're going to be, you know, encouraging. Let's get our, you know, future graduates, you know, take Pacific Studies as your minor, or take some elective classes from Pacific Studies, just to remind us or ground you from things you may have not heard at home, or things you don't be exposed to when you were at primary or secondary school. Wow. Oh, man, I'm looking at the time. I
can tell you, my family's come home and they were giving me dirty looks like, where's dinner? And I'm like, oh my goodness.
Let me see if I can show very quickly to our audience about your book. So maybe that'll end our Talanoa tonight. If you want to share a little bit about your book, I've got a picture of it here. So there you go. Over to you, my dear. So tell us a little bit about your book and how can we access your book?
Oh, my dream had always been that they could sell my book at USP, but I don't know. Every time I tried, it seemed too difficult to order this book at USP. But it is online. It is available through Amazon and a few other, you know, online book sales. It was published by Indiana University Press. And they were a wonderful press for me because they really helped focus the story. They said, tell this Banabin story. This story is so important. And the editors that I worked with there were absolutely wonderful, Bob Foster and other people. So I finished this book in 2015. It is basically the culmination of most of my research, and it is now, I am told, it's used in Pacific studies, anthropology, geography, and history classes all over the world. On a daily basis, I get really beautiful and sometimes really moving feedback from people who read the book. And I've even heard that it's used in the high school curriculum in New Zealand. I know of at least one high school that assigns this as a reading. And when we have our show in Auckland, and when we work with the communities, we're working with Banabin communities in Auckland. Shout out to Maggie and Lillian and Yuki and all the gang in Auckland. We will be sharing more from this book in that context as well. But Ocean Island is the European name for Banaba, so that's where the term comes from, and it kind of weaves together these histories that I've just shared, cultural and political issues, but it grounds it very much on the land. The whole book is a story about the land, and it's basically my argument for people to take the land seriously. You have to take the land seriously. And in the Pacific, land and ocean all connected. When we talk about land, we don't leave out the ocean around our land. It is all incorporated together, but it's basically me tracking the story from Banaba, from Kiribati to Fiji, to Rabe, to New Zealand, to Australia and elsewhere, and talking about the journey of our land, what happened to our land, and what happened to the people. Stories of the land, stories of the people together. And then it's very much kind of positioned from my journey as a researcher, but I also weave in, the arts, I weave in other elements. I do a whole chapter that's a remix, like a music remix, like where I just have like these like quotes and pictures and snippets. And I remember my editor going, wow, what's that? And I said, I don't know. Will you publish it? They were like, okay. And so I have this whole chapter, which is a remix chapter. I have a few reflections on, some things that happened in Fiji history. There's one reflection on being caught in the middle of the coup in Fiji while I'm trying to shop for our Oceania Center dance production. There's all kinds of stories within the book. So I would love for people to be able to order it and read it. It's in libraries as well. So if you can't access it, if you have access to a library, I know this is held by quite a few libraries in Fiji, in the US, in Australia, in New Zealand, elsewhere. There's a bookshop, I think, in Kiribati that actually does have copies of the book. And I've tried to give it to lots of people, but I love getting feedback on the book. And, in true Banabin fashion, one of the Banabin protocols is to apologize in advance for any offense and also any mistakes that have occurred in our research. And any offense and mistakes are things that I completely claim. And I'm happy to talk to people about it, but it's very much from the view and the position of my family, and there could be diversity of experience and opinion amongst other Banabin communities. You can hear my children pouring in, but yes, Banabins, we're a small community, but can I just tell you, we are very diverse, and everyone has their own views, and everyone has their own opinions, and everyone has their own stories and different skills and everything. So I have to also be really, as a Banabin, we are never claiming to be the authority on everything. That is inappropriate. So I can say, As a researcher, I have access to the archives. As a researcher, I get to travel, gather stories, tell stories, share stories, but I can never claim to be a very big authority in a Banaban context, because that's just not appropriate on many levels. So yes, I think that's important to say. The book is there and hopefully it inspires, but if you disagree, that's totally okay too.
Yes, I've got my Madam Maria Teringamoto, Bulavinaka Noaye Maori. She's sending her regards to mom and dad. That's what she's
Oh, Vinaka.
messaging here from out there. Vinaka, Vinaka Baklevu,
Oh.
Madam Maria Teringamoto. And just before we finish today, I know you were showing me the picture behind you. Yeah, if you can just tell us a little bit about it before we finish our Talanoa. I know your children are hungry and you
They
have to
are.
feed them.
Yes, so this is a poster of a CD that my sister, my elder sister Teresia, produced and launched in Fiji and New Zealand in 2008, and it's called I Can See Fiji. I'm pretty sure it's available on Apple and Spotify and other places, but she used to write these poems, you know, all her memories of Fiji. My sister was really deeply in love with you know, with Fiji, with our home country, and she would write these like odes to Fiji. So I Can See Fiji. You know, there's also critique in there and beautiful poetic care and critique and love and tragedy and all kinds of things. But that was a CD that she released, and she signed that poster for us, and I had it framed, and I'm so glad that I did, because it's one of those you know, things that kind of honors the sheer time and energy and care and loloma that she had for our home country. You know, we have three home countries, and Fiji's, you know, where we were born and raised, and there's Kiribati, and there's also the US, and there's also the places that we live now, but Fiji always has a special place in our hearts, and it is where our people are now. So yes, I keep this on the wall as a reminder of my sister's love and care and hard work.
You know, for having you know, a piece of her work you know, as part of our Talanoa today. And even today I was mentioning that you know, when people are seeing the posters, there was a lot of memories and a lot of sharing. So yeah, just remembering her as well today. And there was something else I was going to say before we finish. No, I think that's it. Anything else you want to say? Anyone you want to say hello to? Oh yes, I heard from someone last night that Rabe was celebrating for the win of Fiji. So I just thought I'd mention it. So bula vinaka to everyone on Rabe Island. Vinaka vakalevu for all the fireworks.
Yes, I want to know where the fireworks. That's right. There was this other joke that was going around, which was, which is that for some reason, people in Fiji, whenever there's a celebration, they can always find the fireworks. So I want to know who's got the stash of fireworks on Rabe. But I'm so glad that they celebrated.
That is so good. Yeah. So I was so happy when I heard it from someone yesterday. And then I said, oh, I'll just mention it in our Talanoa today about, you know, Rabe celebrating. So yeah, anybody else you want to say bula or meuri too? This is your time before we finish.
I just want to say, send my my lolomas to all my family in Fiji, all my families at Tapona and Tabyang, all my cousins, to my aunties and uncles, and to my parents, to my sister in New York and my elder sister's family in New Zealand, the whole team in Auckland who's working on Tikanias and also on Project Banaba, my curator Yuki, and all our wonderful friends and colleagues in Pacific Studies and who care so much about our culture and our heritage, you know, in the region and around the world. You know, all this work that we do is so important, and we do hope it leaves a legacy for others.
So from all of us here in Hawaii and everyone who are listening in, they just expressing their gratefulness and vakadidike to your beautiful family and you know, your dear husband and the 2 daughters for supporting the amazing work you do at ANU. So from all of us, you know, for championing a lot of the work over there. And so this is not the first and the last of our Talanoa. I'm sure I will knock on your door again. Maybe when the exhibition in Auckland is up, I will ask you and Yuki to come. Yeah?
Sounds wonderful.
And have another Talanoa. So
it's been wonderful to talk to you.
Same to you. Take care.
Mother
manda, Dr. Katerina. Isa, Vinaka Vakalev Sara, Dr. Katerina, for coming to our Talanoa today. So a big Vinaka Vakalevu to everybody listening in, the Bula Vinaka Sierra Leone, Ella and family, the Bula Vinaka Australia, and those of you connecting in from the US. We just want to say Vinaka for supporting our beautiful sister from the island of Rabe and representing the beautiful island of Banaba. So tomorrow we are inviting Dr. Paulo Vanolilai, who will be continuing the Talanoa from Rabe in tomorrow's session. It will be at 5 o'clock Fiji time. Yes, so 5 o'clock Fiji time. Please join in for our Talanoa session on the session on Rabe. So Vinaka Vakalevu for joining in tonight, and tomorrow is Dr. Paulo Vanolilai, and on Sunday we may have Dr. Chito Vanolilai, Dr. Paulo's brother, and Professor Chito, and also Dr. Polongereti, who will be coming over to talk about the language of Rabe and the language of Kiowa. So that will be another interesting Talanoa on Sunday at 7 p.m. So starting from yesterday with Dr. Rosiana Langi, today with Dr. Katerina Teaiwa, tomorrow Dr. Paulo Vanolilai, and on Sunday, Dr. Chito Vanolilai and Dr. Polongereti. So all this weekend, we are learning all about Rabe and Kiowa. So from Rabe and Kiowa, we want to congratulate the Fiji team, the 7th team who back-to-back win in Tokyo. Vinaka Vakalevu came down the Rogo to Gareth Beba and the team, Vinaka Vakalevu, for getting that gold one more time. And hopefully our Fijiana team will go through to the finals as well. So all the very best to our 2 rugby teams, but not forgetting the other games as well. I know there are other people who are into swimming and a few other games that are being represented by Fiji in Japan. So all the very best wishes to all the athletes who are there at the moment, also thinking of their families who are back in Fiji. So wakanini vinaka to everybody, korapa, Fafetai, Vinaka Vakalevu, Mahalo Nui, Vinaka Vakalevu for joining in our Talanoa tonight. And I will definitely see you all tomorrow at 5 o'clock or 5 o'clock tomorrow, listening to Dr. Paulo Vanolilai. I think Paulo is listening in today as well. Bulavinaka, Dr. Paulo. So I look forward to your Talanoa tomorrow, which I think will continue and adding to Dr. Katerina Teaiwa's Talanoa session. Vinaka Vakalevu Sara to everybody for listening in. I will say hello to a few people here. Serue Eta, Kamal Kant, Bulavinaka, Ravin Kumar, Jesda Nanga, Chesoni Kai, Bulavinaka. Yes, please everybody go and enroll for Pacific Studies at USP. You will never regret it. It's a really, really awesome course. Alicia Vakalala, Bulavinaka, I've not valuable na siya matiko may USP. Elisa Pedro Ngua, Bula vinaka li sapedi vinaka palebra ndo vito ko ni chikumai and nonda Talanoa and lesini konduri bon romo vinaka vakalevo Katerina Ruru Katerina Talifo Alicinda Urewa Telei Tembiu Helen Noga vinaka vakalevo Sara na siama tikumai and Yvonne Brechtefil o sava kuma den vikem ni toda ko Sara so tana sigini mataka na lima na kaloka na kavi ngona mai VITI ni samo de man